Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the Jurassic. Um, and of course, everyone knows the Jurassic because of the movie Jurassic Park. And the movie, of course, if you haven't seen it, I'll tell you what it's about. It was mostly about these large carnivorous dinosaurs. And even though some of them were not Jurassic age, the Triassic-Jurassic boundary is well known for the demise of the herbivores and the rise of the carnivores. So during the Triassic, there were carnivores, of course, around, but they were generally smaller, not the ones that you see in the movie. These big, hungry carnivores. So herbivores went down in number, carnivores went up. The name itself, Jurassic, comes from the Jura Mountains, which are on the border of France and Switzerland, and they're part of the Alps. And this is where the rocks of this age were first studied. And in 1795, von Humboldt described the massive limestone formations in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland as the Calcaire de Jura, or Jura Kalkstein. Kalkstein is chalkstone or limestone. And he wrongly believed that these were older than the Triassic. So he described the rocks, he called them Jurassic, but he thought at the time that the Jurassic was actually older than the Triassic. And then a few years later, between 1796 and 1815, William Smith published a number of geological maps featuring strata that were referred to by Buckland in 1818 as the Oolite Formation or Oolitic series. Oolites are these little round beads that are found in lime rock, and they basically, in the shallow oceans, and in particular in the shallow oceans, some of this lime mud will just roll around with the wave motion, and it forms these little beads, and those beads are called oolites. And then in 1822, Conybeare and Phillips named the underlying strata as the Lias, which we now know as Trias. And then after this, the term was used, terrain jurassique, for the lower oolite, and then the name Lias and oolites continued to be used in Britain until quite recently. And then in 1839, the formal name of Jurassic was adopted by Humboldt and everyone else, of course. We'll take a look at the different types of life in the Jurassic. And it's kind of cool because we're getting to the point in Earth history, even though, it's 150, 160 million years ago. Some of the plants in particular that we see in the Jurassic are still around today. In fact, they haven't really changed all that much at all. We look at the evolution of these gymnosperms appeared for the first time in the Jurassic, and these are the first plants to have seeds. Ginkgos were very common in the Jurassic. Dixoniaceous tree ferns and Catoniaceous sea ferns were relatively successful plants in the kind of shrubby tree size range, and the Cyathecea tree ferns may have and still do reach heights of about 20 meters. So here's some of these fossil ferns. The palm-like Cycadophyta, the cycads, were so abundant and diverse that the Jurassic period could well be called the age of cycads. And you might have these plants in your yard today. In fact, I went out and took this photo here in my yard since I'm teaching from home. And if you've seen these plants, they have this really hard middle part here. This is a fossilized cycad from the Jurassic, and here are Jurassic cycads here. See, they haven't changed really all that much since the Jurassic. So next time you walk down the street or you're outside and you see one of these, you can point out, hey, that plant was from the Jurassic, and that's when they were at their heyday, the age of cycads. In terms of sea life, the sea life in the Jurassic was quite diverse. There were some very big things. You see hands here for scale. The ammonites were quite large. This particular one happens to be from Madagascar. There were also these straight cone belemnites are also very common in the Jurassic. You can see these are the straight cone nautiloids, and these were more the ammonitic type creatures. This is from the Jurassic in India. This is, you can see here some smaller ammonites and a nickel here for scale. This is a Jurassic limestone from India that I collected. And of course, the really nice ones here, these are pyritized. So this is pyrite has grown up on top of the ammonite. So these are pyritized ammonites. Kind of cool fossils. I have a couple of them sitting around. Of course, within the ocean is the ichthyosaur, was probably one of the big ones. This one here is about 18 feet long. It was discovered in India, and there was a recent find, relatively recent find. These two dogs found an ichthyosaur fossil in the beach in England. So here they are with their find. I forget their names, but this ichthyosaur fossil is going to be named after the two dogs that discovered it when they were playing on the seashore. Kind of cool. The Jurassic shark, this so-called frill shark, which people thought were extinct, they've actually now been discovered. They live very, very deep in the ocean. They still do exist. So it's another a relic from the Jurassic that's still alive today. They're weird-looking creatures. In terms of insects, lots of insects similar to what we see today. Here is a modern butterfly. Here is a fossil butterfly. This is a termite, dragonflies, and other types of flies. So lots of insects in the Jurassic that are well preserved, and you can find these. Of course, Jurassic is most famous for its dinosaurs, and following the Triassic extinctions, dinosaurs would rule the Earth for roughly the next 140 million years. And in the Jurassic, the period became the age of the ruling reptiles, and during this period, the vegetation was greener and more lush. We saw some of that. By late Jurassic, the huge dinosaurs, really big, like Stegosaurus, Ceratosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Allosaurus walked the lands, and flying reptiles ruled the sky. And the earliest known birds appeared during the Jurassic. And if you remember, when I gave you a talk about the true polar wander at the end of the Jurassic or during the middle Jurassic, it caused the extinction of some of these first feathered dinosaurs. So flight originated, or actually flight began to be more commonplace within the Jurassic. The dinosaur family tree, we look at it, contains two main offshoots of the primitive, the early dinosaurian clades, and they are referred to as the ornithischians, or the bird hip dinosaurs, and the saurischians, which are the lizard hips. So you can see these are the early dinosaurs, and they branch off into this ornithischian and saurischian, these two clades. And it's important to note that this classification scheme, to be honest with you, has changed. It's gotten a lot more detail. But these basic identifying characteristics, these hips, the types of hips in these two clades, are pretty diagnostic. And when you look at them in a museum, it's pretty straightforward to identify. So the saurischians, the lizard hip dinosaurs, they would have hip bones arranged like those of other reptiles, with one of the two bones below the hip pointing forwards and the other backwards. So we have these bones here, the tail end, the ischium, the pubis here, and the ilium. So this is the typical lizard hip dinosaurs. And then in the ornithischians, both of these bones point backward, although some of the later forms is a forward projecting part of the pubis. So you can see here, this is the tailbone or the hip bone of these two clades of dinosaurs. We'll look at some of these pictures here, and you can tell, you should be able to tell right away what they are. The saurischians included really large plant-eating sauropods that walked on all fours, like Mamenchosaurus, and the large two-legged carnivorous theropods, including Allosaurus. And then among the ornithischians were the duck-billed hadrosaurs, like Syntausaurus and the plated stegosaurs such as Stegosaurus. And all of the ornithischians are thought to have been plant eaters. There hasn't been, at least that I know of, there hasn't been an ornithischian carnivore. Mamenchosaurus is this animal here. It's hard to see the tailbone. We'll see some better pictures, but you can figure out whether they're ornithischians or saurischians. Of course, the most famous, the one that everyone thinks about when they start thinking about the Jurassic, is of course T-Rex, but T-Rex was not a Triassic or Jurassic dinosaur. It actually lived during the Cretaceous period, but his forerunner, Allosaurus, did live during the Jurassic. So that is the carnivorous. The main predator in the Jurassic was Allosaurus. Allosaurus is smaller than T-Rex, but probably still a very powerful meat eater. And here you can see the hip bone with one pointing forward, one pointing backward, typical of the Saurischian dinosaurs. Stegosaurus shown here, another famous dinosaur. This is one of the ornithischians, and if you look at the hip bone here in Stegosaurus, you can see that both bones are pointed towards the back, so this would be an ornithischian dinosaur. Archaeopteryx is believed to be the earliest known bird, and it's actually considered to be an intermediate between the birds and predatory dinosaurs, or in other words, a possible link between reptiles and birds. And it's still debated whether or not the Archaeopteryx could actually fly or whether it just glided from tree to tree. It did have wings. There's some arguments about the dynamic of flight and the weight of Archaeopteryx and whether or not that it could actually fly. And there's the famous fossil. In terms of plate tectonics in the Jurassic, if we go back to 170 million years ago in the Middle Jurassic, we can see that Gondwana is beginning to separate from North America. So this is North America. I know it's hard to tell which of these are which. This is South America and Africa, but right in here, right sandwiched in here, prior to the breakup, there was a little piece of land here called Florida. And when this breakup occurred, following the large eruptions in the Triassic, Florida was left behind and attached to North America. So during the Jurassic, we started to see Pangaea begin to break apart. North America was drifting westward, opening the Gulf of Mexico, and the Central Atlantic was forming. In Gondwana, the initial narrow split between South America and Africa that began during the Triassic widened into a configuration resembling the present-day Red Sea. And a new seafloor began to form in the nascent South Atlantic. So the South Atlantic was just beginning to break apart during the Jurassic. And there was also a great rift separating Antarctica from the southern ends of South America and Africa, and developing another arm that extends eastward from South Africa along what is presently the eastern side of India, which began to drift northward. During the Jurassic, the extent of the oceans was far more widespread than they had been in the Triassic, and this has everything to do with the fact that that the temperature started to rise on the planet, and because the continents were breaking apart, of course, it was creating new oceanic crust, and so we were starting to see more seafloor being created. So the Jurassic sea levels rose and flooded large portions of the continent. And of course, whenever you have warm, shallow seas, you have a rich diversity of life as well. So let's just show this again in the early Carboniferous. So we're going back to 356 million years ago. I'm just going to show you where Florida was here. Here's South America. Here's Africa. The Florida Peninsula, which includes part of Georgia, was sitting right here, sandwiched between Africa and South America. So it was part of Gondwana, Florida was. And you can see that North America, Euro-America was a little bit further north. If you start to compare the geology in a very simplistic form, but if you begin to compare the geology of Florida and southern Georgia to West Africa, you can see these rock types match up quite nicely, both in terms of age and rock type from Florida to Africa. So the links here are very, very good. And now it just so happens that you can also make links between these same units in South America, but of course South America and Africa were together since the Cambrian, so it's not surprising that you find these links. Lastly, if you recall, I mentioned that during the Middle Jurassic, there was an episode of true polar wander that occurred. And true polar wander is where you have the entire outer lithosphere plus mantle moving in unison fairly quickly. And I talked at that particular time. I was talking about East Asia moving from the humid temperate climates down into arid climates. But you can see there were many changes around the globe during this episode of true polar wander. So that's one of the big tectonic events. And then, of course, following the Jurassic, we move into the Cretaceous, and you can watch that lecture.